Okay, so to tie up what I was trying to say to start off with and let you have a reply, um, what I'm fundamentally starting off with is that the question of ethics, I think, is framed well by the question of what should I do, and that the answer shouldn't assume to be in the form of do what is moral, which is X, Y, and Z, because I don't believe there to be any moral properties in the world. Now, I have to, of course, in subsequent chapters, explain what I mean by all these terms, like what are moral properties and how exactly do I reject them. But to start off with, I wanted to separate the practice of morality or moralizing and all those things from ethics, which in informal conversations are conflated and used, interchangeably. Yeah. So did I kind of get what you're saying in some of your works on closely or somewhere?
Oh, well, absolutely. You and I have been corresponding for a number of years, so
I hope so.
But we started corresponding because we were already in sync, and it's been a terrific dialogue all these years. But there's just one thing about the way you have articulated the big picture, which I will take issue with. And it does create some problems for me as well as you. You use the phrase, what should I do, a number of times. You said this is the question I'm really concerned about. You were saying, what should I do, not what's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do or the moral thing to do. And yeah, that's a natural way to frame it. But I think it gets us both, it would get either of us in trouble to speak that way, because the very word should tends to bring with it the whole idea of right and wrong and even morality and immorality. So if one wants to really be amoral, or the other term you used, to be a moral nihilist for real in actual practice, I think you need another way to articulate the most fundamental question that you're really concerned about. Instead of saying what I do, instead of saying, well, what I'm really interested in is, what should I do? Or what should I do? I try not to say that anymore. I try to say, well, what will I do? Or what shall I do?
Right.
That's what I want to say.
What would I do? Yeah.
Or what, under such circumstances, what would I do? Now the problem with that terminology, it avoids using should and shouldn't and ought and oughtn't. But the problem was just saying, well, what will I do? What will I do? What will I do? What should I? What shall I do? What would I do if I were in such and such circumstances? The problem with that kind of terminology is that it's hard to distinguish from pure prediction or hypothesis. Well, what would I do if I were in a pandemic, Or, well, now that I am in a pandemic, what will I do? Or what am I going to do? Or what, that sounds like you're pondering, well, tomorrow, what will I discover that I'm doing? Can I make a prediction of it? I predict that tomorrow I'm going to wear a mask, because I'm in a pandemic. So that's what I'll do. Tomorrow I'll be wearing a mask. But that's not exactly the question we want to be asking, is it? It's not. We don't just want to be asking about a prediction or making a prediction.
No, that's right.
We're not asking for a prediction or a hypothetical. Well, this is what I would do. We're trying to, our language doesn't accommodate this very easily, because our whole language is geared towards this moralistic way of thinking. The idea that there's an objective right and an objective wrong, and an objective good and an objective bad for that matter, which I also reject, and I'm not quite sure if you do or not, but we can talk about that. But certainly the right and wrong, I reject that. But so if I'm pondering, well, so what to do, I'm not just wondering, about what is the correct prediction to make about myself. So how do we express that? Well, and what are we even saying? What is even the meaning of the question if it's not the should question and it's not the prediction question? Then what kind of a question? What is the meaning of the question? You have a thought on that?
Well, I have a thought. So I think you're bang on correct to ask what you have asked, which is
what are we asking?
Yeah. So I think that when we think in ethical dilemmas, we're looking for an objective solution, but there are none. So my framing of the question of what should I do hints that I kind of want to keep going back to objectivity.
Right.
But I don't. At least I don't believe I do. Maybe you can point out my flaws. But
by the way, excuse me for interrupting. I have to compliment you on the precision of your use of language. I mean, even though right now we're quibbling about, well, it's more than a quibble. We're discussing about whether it's proper to use the word should as you were using it just prior. But this is a real difficult issue. So that's not a criticism of your being not particularly articulate. You're extremely articulate, and your thinking is extremely precise and what I would call analytic in the sense of an analytic philosopher. So even though you don't have a degree in analytic philosophy, when you contacted me out of the blue years ago, about my writing and so forth, I immediately picked up on your having a truly analytic mind, a precise thinker, and a person who can articulate in a precise, articulate manner. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to compliment you on that. That is why I have been very happy to continue this dialogue with you for all these years and hopefully for forever. Please continue.
That means a lot. That means a lot. I tell you what, because coming from yourself, I mean, we can sit here and congratulate each other, but I really mean, like, it's an honor to be talking to you because I recognize that you're absolutely gone through the ranks of all the official ways of becoming schooled and learned in these topics. And, I haven't. And so the fact that you, spend time and have corrected me and been patient with me as I have more than once, I think, sent emails which were too long and taken up way too much of your time. But it's been, I appreciate that you, keep giving me your time. And but anyway, get back to the topic because it was interesting. So
sure was. Yeah.
So the question, as I said, framed it as what should I do, which implies there's a should. But I think the only way that so the should, which means that there's an obligation, right? So if there's an obligation to do something, there has to be a consequence. If I say that you're obligated to fulfill your duty, or if you're obligated to uphold the contract that we've come to, or whatever, and you could always say, no, I'm not going to do that. And I'll say, you are obligated because you said you would, or there's a social contract, or that I've got a legal contract, or I will beat you up if you don't. In each of those cases, there's a consequence. And if there is no consequence, the person who says, well, or else what? So I think the should and the idea of objectivity, which has lots of facets to it, like how do we know it's objective? We can get all that. But just in terms of should having a relationship to obligation, it only makes sense if there's a enforceable consequence. If it's not enforceable, it's just meaningless words. And this is getting down to my my understanding or my conceptualizing. It's sort of a third of the way into my book at this point. This is after I've kind of said what I want to do, and I've kind of already established that I reject moral realism, and then I go into a different thing where it's like, well, this is how I see the world. It's possibly flawed, very, very flawed, but I kind of start off with an understanding of physical forces and objects and consciousness and how these things relate, and then I build up from that to the idea of rights. So the word rights. So if someone says, let me just start off, if I can go on this little tangent for a moment. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to reply to that I've already said before.
Please continue. I find this fascinating.
So let me just kind of explain what I've said in my words in this one little particular essay, and I'll give you a grounding of how I sort of think of things. And I'm sure it'll change in time because I'm learning a lot. But so in the world, there's lots of material, physical things, and they can interact, right? And then there's this other thing called consciousness, which has this problem which we don't know quite how the mechanics of it work. I think it's called the hard problem of consciousness, and there's some sort of connection between consciousness and our physical body. So because we have consciousness, we can intend for physical reactions. So physical interactions, sorry. So there's in the world, there are interactions, but some interactions are intended. And those are the interactions that a mind does through this bizarre connection between mind body. And so I can have property. I can hold something and say this is mine. And I make a distinction for my purposes of using language by saying property is different from ownership. So what I'm trying to do with this topic is to say, anything that I'm in control of is my property. But when I say I have a right to it, I'm actually making an ethical claim. So, for example, I'll wrap this up real quick. If I have a house, and it's my property, it's one thing because I'm in control of it. And if I say I have house rights or home rights or ownership over this land or whatever, what I'm doing with that statement is I'm making an ethical assertion. I'm implicitly saying that if anyone was to come and take it from me, I would have been slighted, I would have been wronged. And I'm also saying that I will have the right to enforce some sort of consequence on you, whether it's myself or through a police state or however it's done. So there's a difference between just literally controlling an object and making an assertion of rights. So once you make the jump to the subjective claim to having rights, you're necessarily saying that you are going to enforce, at the end of the day, through physical means, consequences for any slight or any wrong that you feel. There's no objective wrong, but it starts with the individual mind that says, I will enforce a physical consequence to you for not agreeing to respect my claim to having a right. So it's a subjective claim to start with, but when it's slighted, or when it's maybe I used the wrong word by saying slighted, but when it's not the right word, but when that right has been violated, I'm going to hit you, or I'm going to take it back and reestablish my control over this property. So when tying this back to the question of shoulds and what should I do, there's no objective thing of what you should do, but there are subjective claims, implicit perhaps, but they're there, that say this is my house, it's my property, I have the right to it. And if someone was to say, should I burn your house, I would say, no, you should not burn my house, because implicit in that is if you do that, I will get the police to put you in a jail. Physically, and going back down to the physical consequences of all things, is the physical consequences is what's at the base of every ethical claim. It's two things. It's you're saying what you want, and you're asserting your values, and they're making sense linguistically by tying it back to physical reality. That's a lot there, but maybe maybe that's something you can jump in on. I don't know.
Wow. Okay. Well, I do have a number of responses. Um, you know, what often happens with philosophers, and you are definitely a philosopher, is that we just have so many ideas, you know, and we're so excited about them. And we can be very, you know, as I'm saying, very precise and articulate about each idea, but then the danger is we kind of jumble them all together, and that can be a real risk. So now this could just be that I didn't follow well enough everything you were saying, because it's quite a mouthful. But my sense is it's a jumble. Okay, a number of ideas which in themselves are very intriguing, but they don't necessarily connect seamlessly. Even though, as you spoke about them, it seemed you were going quite naturally from one to the next in your own mind. But, you know, if we now put a mirror to your mind, as I like to put it, you know, maybe we would, and looked at that carefully, we might find that the connections are, maybe there aren't even connections at all sometimes. Okay, so let me get a little more specific about that, and you can respond. Maybe you want to respond to each thing one at a time or all together, because what I'm saying could be a jumble too, if I try to have replied to all the different things that I
let's hear what you've got to say, and maybe one at a time might be the most fruitful. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing is that let me make it the most important one first. What I think is most important first. It sounded to me sometimes like you were analyzing moral concepts in such a way that you could give them substantive meaning, real meaning. And you were doing it in terms of consequences, you said. And for different moral concepts, you were suggesting the different types of consequences that could be relevant. And that is a perfectly fine philosophical exercise, conceptual analysis. But aren't you falling into the trap then of justifying the use of moral terminology? Aren't you in effect suggesting perhaps an alternative to the mainstream analysis or understanding of certain moral concepts like right or rights, or obligation or should, and so forth and so forth? You know, so maybe you're objecting to the prevailing interpretation, which you and I might both call objectivist, and you and I don't like objectivist interpretations of moral concepts. So you might be suggesting a subjectivist interpretation of various moral concepts in terms of the consequences that there would be if these concepts were instantiated in certain actions or attitudes. But the amoralist project, as I understand it, and as I think you also want it to be, is to ultimately eliminate moral concepts from our, not just our vocabulary, but from our thinking, from our attitudes, from our feelings. So we don't just want another way of thinking about or analyzing moral concepts so that then we can still use them in a subjectivistic way. No, our real goal is to analyze moralistic concepts in such a way that they are shown to be objectivistic, and therefore we want to get rid of them entirely.
Okay, so two things. I'm not sure, and this is a side point I can get back to, not my main point I want to make here, but I don't know whether I don't think I'm a moral abolitionist, but I could be wrong. I
Okay.
could be wrong on that. I think, and I really want to read up more on these things, but I think I might
Explain
be.
to our listeners, if we have any, what that means, a moral abolitionist.
Sure, and I think I'm more of a moral fictionalist, but we'll get to so a
Okay,
moral.
well, that will explain everything. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, right. So the moral abolitionist thinks,
Which is what I am, by the
yeah,
way.
of course. So yeah, of course. So you're a moral abolitionist, along with Richard Garner, and I think there'll be some others that I don't know, but they're the two that I think of. Who what they want
Ian
to do
Hinksis,
is
I think, who is, I think, Australian or possibly from a Kiwi. Is that what you call them? An Aussie or a Kiwi?
No, Kiwis are over the other side of the Tasman Sea. Yeah, the New Zealanders. Yeah, the moral abolitionist wants to get rid of moral concepts and language and thinking in these ways, and they think basically that it's going to be almost fell for the trap and said it's going to be better to not, but it's almost like the desire is to abolish moral concepts and thinking.
Yes, yes.
Rather than to, maybe it makes more sense to start with what a fictionalist might say, and then to contrast that with the abolitionist. So the fictionalist would say,
okay, sure.
And this, I'm not trying to say I know what that position is fully, and that therefore I'm representing it. But what I want to say is, I think in everyday speech, we all use words informally, and so I have no personal qualms with people saying to me, "Oh, you're a good guy, you did this, okay, whatever. I understand that you just like that, that's fine." And I, philosophically, I don't really see any harm in being, using language inconsistently. But then when it comes philosophically, I like deeply, metaethically, I don't believe in objective values. So again, I'm not too across that topic. I just know that objectively, I don't believe moral properties exist. So to get back to the main issue I think you brought up, which was my use of, say, social consequences for, what should I do socially, or what should I do legally? I think because I tie them down to the answer to those questions would be related to what someone subjectively chooses to do. I want to not be put in jail for not following the law, or I want to not lose my invitation to the dinner party next week. So therefore I'm going to obey this social obligation. The should is completely subjective and therefore contingent on their own desires, their own intentions. And so it doesn't, I don't think, and I'd like you to help me if I am, I don't think I'm falling into the trap of still being objectivist. I think my concept
No, that's not what I was saying. I think if there's anybody listening, I think we do need to clarify some concepts, right? That's what we're talking about, concepts.
Sure.
That's why we're philosophers here. Okay. You had begun the discussion by referring to some terminology, and now I guess the terminology does become a little more important because we are making substantive decisions that relate to the different terms that are used. Sometimes what's so confusing is that sometimes the different terms are used interchangeably, but other times they're used to make distinctions. So now we need them to make distinctions. So strictly speaking, or traditionally speaking, maybe I should say, a moral nihilist is someone who believes that there is no such objective thing as right and wrong, and possibly even good or bad. Like you were saying, there are like physical things, there are physical objects like your phone and like atoms and planets and so forth, right? But, especially for a materialist, of course, in a materialist universe, you're not going to find right and wrong out there. Or you use the word properties, which is a good word to use also. That there's no, the action of kicking a dog, okay, is a physical action, okay? That's a real thing in the physical world, we might say. But kicking the dog being wrong is not any kind of a real property. It's not a property. It's not a property of kicking the dog that it's wrong. Not in reality. There's no such real property. And you accept that. You are a moral nihilist in that sense, and so am I. I don't want anybody to be kicking dogs, and neither
No,
do you,
no.
right? Very strongly don't want anybody to be kicking dogs. But to say that it's objectively wrong to kick dogs brings a whole lot of other stuff in besides just our not wanting it to happen and our not liking it. And as you were suggesting, it could bring in such things as consequences, so that, well, you know, in our society anyway, if somebody kicks a dog, they could be, you know, put in jail or something like that.
Yep.
Or, you know, if you did it, your girlfriend wouldn't like you anymore, and things
Or
like
they
that.
could get bitten. You know, like they
And
could
you
just
could
get
get
bitten.
bitten. Right, right. So, so there would be all these additional things that might make us say, well, not only is it a physical action of a foot, you know, hitting the body of a dog, but it's also got this property of being wrong. And that's just what we mean by it's being wrong, all these other things too. But it's even more than that to say that it's objectively wrong. It's usually also means something like, or even in some people's minds, literally like, God doesn't like it and God will punish you.
Mm-hmm.
Or even leaving God out of the picture, something like karma. If you do that, well, you'll be reborn as a dog. If you kick a dog, you know, that'll teach you, you know, there will be consequences in this metaphysical cosmic sense. But even beyond that, if you're like a secular minded, scientific minded, analytic philosopher, you would say, oh, no, I don't believe in the metaphysics of karma. I don't believe in the theistic, you know, supernatural God stuff. No. The analytic, objective meaning of kicking the dog being wrong is what? Something, you know, it's very hard to articulate. And the reason I personally think it's hard to articulate is because I think it's nonsense. It's nothing. It's just, we just have very strong feelings about, oh, it's just bad. It's a bad thing. It's wrong. It's, but I just don't think there's anything there.
Yep.
Other than those, the supernatural God or the metaphysical karmic consequences in a future life and reincarnation, none of which I believe in, you know. So that's why I'm a moral nihilist, and I think that's probably why you're a moral nihilist too. Okay, so we're agreed on that. But now the issue is, well, folks, and I will blow myself up here because this is so dramatic. Okay, this is so important and everything. Okay, now we get to the nitty gritty, folks. Okay, all right. There's no such thing as right and wrong and good and bad in any objective, cosmic, whatever sense, you know, supernatural, metaphysical sense. Not in the sense that we're used to assuming. And for some people, it's like the most important thing in the world.
Yeah.
It was for me for most of my life.
I was going to say.
For most of my life, it was the most important thing in the world. And
Yeah.
some things were absolutely wrong, you know, or absolutely right, and an obligation to do. And something. What do I do now that I don't believe in this stuff anymore? Okay, so a number of philosophers have confronted this problem. Now, this is still not, I don't think this is certainly not the mainstream of the contemporary analytic philosophers, but there are a number of, you know, perfectly respectable, like me, contemporary analytic philosophers, and there have been historically philosophers who are very close to that, like, you know, Nietzsche, David Hume, and so forth and so forth. They've definitely been, you know, dealing with very similar ideas. And so various ways of approaching this, dealing with this real deep problem. It's a practical problem, not just a theoretical problem, because you're just trying to figure out well, as you put it originally, how should I live? But I don't want to use the word should. So what do I do now? How do I live my life now? What's, I can't even ask the question, well, what's right or wrong? I can't even ask the question. So it's so confusing. All right. So various answers to this have arisen. And perhaps the two most, I don't know if they're the most, but let's just say for our present discussion, the you and I think about most of the time, the two most prominent answers or solutions to this dilemma for you and me have been what go by the name of moral fictionalism and moral abolitionism. Mm-hmm. And these are not necessarily the best terms, by the way. Terms are always a problem. But these are the terms that you're most likely to come across nowadays. All right. So the moral fictionalist, like somebody like Richard Joyce, who is a countryman of yours, will say that, yeah, objectively, there's no such thing. But subjectively, we still have these very strong impulses to consider certain things right and wrong. And I'll put aside good and bad for the moment. That's a separate discussion.
Well, I'd like to come back to that. I'd like to come back to that clarification.
I want to also, right. But just to keep this particular discussion within bounds. So yeah, there's no such thing really. It is a fiction.
Yep.
Right and wrong. Or a myth. That was the word that Richard Garner used, the myth. But nonetheless, it is so useful for us to be able to draw upon the concepts of right and wrong. Because, as you were saying, it has consequences in language. And also because we're just so familiar with the terminology, it would be hard work, it would seem, for us not to be able to say, oh, that's right, that's wrong. Like you were just seeing, it's hard. You don't know what to say. You'd be speechless on a lot of occasions when you need to say something. So people like, Richard Joyce would say, so we really need to retain the language. And when you get right down to it, we may not be able to do without it. It may be hardwired, just like some people say, there are no atheists in foxholes. Mm-hmm. Maybe a moral fictionalist might say, there are no amoralists in foxholes either. It's just really mentally impossible for the human mind not to think in these terms.
Can I ask a clarification here?
Yep.
So I think that a lot of the time moral language is just another layer of another set of terms we use to convey what we feel strongly. But I don't actually know, like I said, that much about the real position of fictionalism versus abolitionism. And because I actually don't, I don't think it's useful. I don't think moral terms are useful. I think they get in the way. I think that in many uses, it'd be better if we didn't use them. But
well, that's moral abolitionism.
So I need to clarify my thoughts on this, but I just think on a day-to-day level, like if someone says, if I pat my dog and go, you're a good boy, obviously he's not a philosophing mind that can, but these terms, we use moral terms all the time, and I have no personal qualms with that. But philosophically, I think that they're all false, and I think that they're actually just making the task of anyone who's really trying to get down to the bottom of things just more difficult, because there's just more layers of what do you mean, and so in that regard, we might as well just throw them away. But maybe that clarifies what I think on that.
Well, okay, that's helpful. So again, so I characterized moral fictionalism. By the way, when I used the word fiction with moral fictionalism, I don't think I used it the way the moral fictionalist would want to use it, because I think for the moral fictionalist, that's too much of a fine point. Let me just move on. Okay, now moral abolitionism just says, no, it's not that difficult to do without moral language, really. And furthermore, and this is the main argument, I think we'd all think we'd all like the way things turned out more if everybody stopped using moral language, and especially stopped thinking in moral terms, to thinking that way, to having certain attitudes like, oh, you're wrong, or that's bad, and things like that. You know, so moral abolitionism says, so again, the word abolition is terrible. Maybe eliminate or something, but I would just say, I would prefer that people just didn't use moral language and didn't think in moral terms. That's what I think moral abolitionism is. Now, what you just said is a nice little modification there, qualification. A moral abolitionist doesn't have to believe in political correctness. You know that term?
Sure.
Do you know that term? You know,
yeah, of course.
People who go around, don't use that word, don't use the feminine, the masculine pronoun, or, all these fine distinctions. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with that. I really do. I do myself try to avoid using the masculine pronoun when I just mean everybody, and so forth and so forth. But past a certain point, it gets irritating. And if you're trying to, and doesn't seem important, really, in a lot of contexts, and you become like a school marm, in the bad sense. Whoops. In the sense we don't like.
Yeah.
And if your point is to change the world, to make it more the way you want it to be and would like it to be, then you don't want to go around irritating people and annoying them.
Yeah.
Right? And making unnecessary hardships when you're already asking for something which is somewhat difficult. So I would take what you said as a useful corrective. I would still then call you a moral abolitionist, but simply one who is not interested in in political correctness. You would just say, and tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, that, look, there's, in the sense that people have traditionally meant, there is literally no such thing as right and wrong or good and bad, okay? And furthermore, when we use that language, we get into a frame of mind which really makes life more difficult, because we get angrier at one another, and we get more adamant in our own positions and less willing to compromise about things, and we're more likely to fight about things and even have wars about things, and so forth and so forth. So I suggest that, it would work out in a way that we'd all prefer if we just kind of like, if we possibly could just stop using moralistic language at all. But life being what it is, and we've got all these habits, and maybe it's even hardwired to a certain degree, and so forth and so forth. Let's not be picky about it. Let's not be silly about it. We're going to keep using words like right and wrong and good and bad on various occasions and so forth. But as long as we all are with the program now, the new program, that we know it doesn't mean what people used to mean by it, and it doesn't mean what religious people mean by it, and it doesn't mean, what superstitious people mean by it, and metaphysical people mean by it. It just means things that we can understand in everyday mundane terms. We understand that it has a lot of subjectivity involved. We understand that we're going to end up with a lot of relativity. We're going to understand that some people will say, oh yeah, that's good. That other people will say, oh no, that's bad. If we can live with all of that, then we don't have to completely eliminate and abolish all moral language and thinking. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, but I'll make one question clarification.
Sure.
Is, how you say, if we stop thinking in these terms, the world might be more the way we prefer it to be. Because maybe we would stop, maybe there'd be less wars, because we'd be less prone to take a stance on a position that comes from a moral understanding of what things should be, and so we don't retaliate from a feeling of being morally wronged or things like this. I think all of that would still happen. I don't think in the world much would change at all, except for the way we see things, because I think that we have evolved to use these words. So I was just going to say, I'm not so sure that if we stop thinking in moral terms, that the world would be very much different. I don't think that abolishing moral thinking will change, for the most part, what we see empirically going on. I think if we basically conceptualize morality as different people having different sets of desires, but then we get rid of moral terms, there's still going to be people competing in the world with different desires, and there's going to be there's limited resources in the world. So if we stop saying that, say, I don't know, China did the wrong thing or the immoral thing, and therefore we're going to put in certain sanctions on their trade as a moral response to whatever happened, these things will still happen. We just won't have the moral terms for it. So I just don't think that I agree with that one particular point that you made about moral abolitionism, that we would find the world much different for that effect.
Well, all right. Again, very interesting and more subtle distinctions called for. I guess I should put myself back in the picture here. I certainly agree that many things would not change if we somehow, everybody stopped using moral terminology, and even stopped having moralistic attitudes, right? But I think other things would change. And indeed, that's the point. I mean, why bother with getting rid of the moral terminology if doing that also would not have consequences, to use your word, right? I mean, that's the point of doing anything, isn't it? Well, I don't know, that's another issue. But it's certainly an important point a lot of the time, that what you do will have certain consequences. So certainly my motives, and I would assume Richard Garner's motives and the motives of any other moral abolitionist I'm aware of, I would assume their motives, like mine, for being a moral abolitionist, have to do with our belief that there will be consequences that we like happening in the world, precisely because people stop using moral terminology, and especially because they stop thinking about things in moral terms. What would remain the same in terms of consequences, I believe, would be, of course, all of our non-moral emotions and the behaviors and motives and thoughts that we have as a result of them, or that might even constitute them sometimes, right? So in my case, whether I'm a moralist or an amoralist, I don't want anybody kicking dogs. And if I see that, I don't want them eating any animals, et cetera, right? And if I see somebody kicking a dog, just to stay with the same example,
yep,
I will still feel bad because, well, it could be a number of reasons depending upon the particular emotions I have, but it could be because I'm compassionate, and so it hurts me that the dog is being hurt, and is feeling pain. I'm empathetic, which is a similar idea. I'm,
yeah,
I just don't like it, et cetera, all right?
Yeah.
That feeling could remain, whether I also think it's wrong to kick the dog or not. I might not believe in right and wrong, which I don't, but I would still have compassion for the dog and not want the dog to be kicked. So I'd have the bad feeling of my desire being frustrated, the desire that the dog not be kicked or in pain, and my caring about the dog, would also be frustrated. And my empathy would result in my feeling the pain that the dog is feeling, and so forth and so forth. So a lot of stuff, and I think the really important stuff, by which I mean the stuff I care about, would remain in a world where people stopped using moral language and stopped having moralistic attitudes. But the reason I want people to not only not kick the dog, but not think that it's wrong to kick the dog,
Right.
is that I believe that not only kicking a dog has consequences I don't like, but also thinking that it's wrong to kick the dog has consequences that I don't like. So, and the main one being that when people add on that attribution of wrongness or badness, etc., in addition to all the non-moral desires they have desires that take on a life of their own, even though they're about something completely fictitious. And it leads to conflict and bad feelings and so forth and so forth. Just precisely analogously to the way people who believe in an objective God who is on their side and wants to destroy the enemy, will go and destroy the enemy because they think God wants them to, Or all these idiots that we have who go around shooting people because they think God wants them to do it,
But do you think that we can get rid of that type of thinking? Do you think it's possible for the human animal? It might be possible for some philosophers, maybe, but is it possible for the human being species to, whether we use moral terms or new terms, to completely stop thinking about the things that we don't like kicking dogs, to take that example, and to not at some point take it to another higher level and think about it in ways that are internally, even if we reject moral terms, but is it possible for this animal that we are to stop taking it to that next level? I think for the most part, probably not. But that's a different thing to whether or not it would be preferable to not doing that thing.
All right. This is great. I mean, we're really getting to the nitty gritty here, Okay. Let me introduce a tangential meta-philosophy or something here. I don't know what it is.
Right.
It's something else I've been thinking a lot about recently, and it's directly relevant to this. But I just want to mention it in passing as like, a note, and we'll take it up at another conversation sometime because it definitely merits its own conversation. But, I now not only don't think there are definite, right, objective, true answers to moral questions, I don't think there are objective, right, true answers to any questions.
Define any.
Any question. Define any.
Yeah.
What I mean, that's all. So I said, I don't want to get into it right now, all right? But so I'm saying that because what I want to say to you now is I agree with you and I disagree with you, okay? That's why I wanted to add that little note there, right? I can always say that to you. I've been tempted several times in our discussion today to say to you, yes and no, which I've said this before to many people in many contexts. I owe this ultimately to my just recently departed mentor, Joel Kupperman. a wonderful philosopher, a wonderful man, and a mentor to me. Okay, he would say yes and no. All right, and now I say that all the time. Okay, so that's an aside. So now I want to say the way in which I agree with you and the way I disagree with you. All right, I agree that we're not going to. Well, I don't believe we are going to get. It's an empirical question, so I don't know the answer. Okay,
Yeah.
but I agree with you. I think it's very unlikely that human beings can ultimately rid themselves of the moralistic feelings and attitudes. Yes, I agree. That's probably one reason why moral fictionalists think it's not only useful, it's inevitable that we retain moral language and so forth and moral attitudes, because we can't get rid of them. And again, it's the old idea of there are no atheists in foxholes, and maybe there are no amoralists in foxholes either, or when seeing somebody kicking the dog. So I agree with that, but I also disagree with that. And here's an analogy that I use again and again because it's just perfect. It's just it might not even be just an analogy. It might be the thing in itself. But I'll call it an analogy for now. The analogy is to illusions. Well, what would really be an analogy would be to talk specifically about visual illusions. Like take one, the one where you have parallel lines which have arrows at the ends.
And they make the lines look longer or shorter?
Right, the Muller illusion, right. And however you pronounce it.
Yeah.
And how did you pronounce it?
No, I didn't say it. I just was asking whether it's the illusion that makes the lines look longer or shorter depending on the other stuff.
It looks like the lines are of unequal length.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. But they're of equal length. You can put up a tape measure and see they're the same length.
Yeah.
So now that illusion is a perfect analogy to what I'm talking about, because, okay, I agree with you. We will always have moral feelings. And maybe you will agree with me, okay, whenever we look at the Muller illusion, we will see unequal lines. One line will look longer than the other. One line will look shorter than the other. Mm-hmm. Okay, always, all right? But I disagree with you that therefore we cannot become moral abolitionists, because you would disagree with me if I said, well, then you can never know that those lines are of equal length. You would disagree with me because, of course, you can know that the lines are of equal length. You can just hold up a tape measure to them and see absolutely and convince yourself 100% that they are of equal length. And even if you had like two physical objects, two thin pencils or something with those arrows at the end, and you happen to need two physical objects of the same length for something you were building, let us say, some little stick thing you were building, you would take those two, you would get rid of the arrows at the ends, and you would take those two objects feeling fully confident that you would end up with two pencils of the exact same length, so you could build your little stick house or whatever, right?
Yep.
So you would know, you would say, yes, I know they are of the same length, even though for the rest of your life, whenever you look at them with those arrows at the end, they still appear to be of unequal length. So I would say analogously that, yeah, even if there's no way we can rid ourselves of the feeling, oh, that's wrong, that guy kicking that dog, that's just wrong to do. We're going to feel that way, Nonetheless, I think that somebody who is convinced of moral nihilism, that there are no real objective moral properties, could continue to say to him or herself, okay, I really feel that's wrong, I hate it. But I know nothing is wrong. Nothing is right, nothing is wrong, nothing is permissible in any objective sense. I know that what's happening right now is that I'm having a very strong feeling, which is built into me, just like a visual illusion, that I'll never get rid of it. But nonetheless, I have enough layers of mentality that I can control my mind and even my feelings to some degree, to moderate my feelings here about the wrongness, still retaining my extreme dislike of the kicking of the dog and wanting it to stop and behaving accordingly and trying to get the guy to stop kicking the dog. All right,
Sure.
I can retain all of that, but I can at the same time work on that super mystical, abstract, whatever it is, conception of it's wrong, so that it's affecting me less, even though it's still affecting me, and simply refuse to give it much attention, to use the powers that and speaking for myself, that I have developed through years of meditating, to draw my attention away from the thought that I don't want to be paying attention to because it's just a distraction, and bring my attention to the thought I do want to be paying attention to, which is that I really don't like that, and I'm going to do what I can to get the guy to stop kicking the dog.
Yep. So, I mean, maybe 100,000 years away, possibly humans could have developed a different perception mechanism that wouldn't see those visual illusions as the way we see them, So in that same way, analogously, maybe somehow way along in the future, we could evolve to not think in moral terms. I'm sure you're nodding along, so you get what I'm saying with that. But of course, that's way down the line and probably not even possible. Empirically, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But the thing is, the question that comes to me in what you just said was, does it not mean that, you're meditating, I'm guessing, to stop you from tending towards how you used to think as a moralist? So you don't go down that way of thinking so as to add extra layers of error, as also to compound the feelings that you're having. Because maybe you're trying to avoid becoming extra moral or moralizing, when you know that all you need to hold on to is the understanding and the feeling that you don't like the person kicking the dog. You don't need to then go another layer and say, I'm even more angry now because he kicked the dog, and that's immoral. And so if you just get rid of that layer, you can still be angry, but not have to have any erroneous abstract layers that don't exist, don't have any relation to reality. But what I'll ask you about this question is, I think all emotions serve a purpose. We've evolved to have them for a reason. And one example would be that anger motivates us to act. If someone punches my partner in the street and I feel no anger, I'd probably just look at it and go, oh. But of course, naturally, I would feel a lot of anger. And depending on how I handle my anger, I will either retaliate or do something. So it's the emotions that make us act. And so I wonder if you are meditating to lower yourself from this level of anger or perception or feelings, to bring yourself down to a level where you still have that quality, but not in that quantity. Are you not just making yourself into a person that just does less, more acts less, becomes more ascetic, becomes less involved in the world? And I go back to what I said earlier, which is that I think that process is not really one that is going to
ultimately happen with a moral abolitionist project, because I think that ultimately you might have reasons to think that that will happen, but again, the majority of people won't go down that way, and I think that as a result there'll still be this layer of I was wronged. Maybe I'm missing the point, because you're trying to say that if we could get to this point, then there wouldn't be that layer. But I think what I'm saying is, maybe I'm making 2 points. So back to the first. I'm making a number of sub points to support my point, but my point is,
I understand. That's what philosophers do.
But my main point, the one that was new that I hadn't already said, was this: is that I just think that, is it not a problem for the amoralist to really, they're taking themselves away from life? Because
yes, it is not a problem. Yes, it is not a problem. Okay, look, you're making the standard objection to moral abolitionism. And some people would even use it as an objection to any kind of amoralism. They would say you have to believe in morality, not just, continue to want to use the language and so forth. We would be lost. But again, it's exactly like the people who say, look, without God, anything has happened. People will be murdering, da 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 da. It's just not true. It's just not empirically true. I would claim. And I'll take issue with your using the word anger. Okay. Although again, I could be wrong. That's to say mistaken, not wrong in the moral sense. But of course, I've also told you now I don't think there's any kind of wrong, or there is, but there's also right. There's both or neither, whichever way you want to talk about it. That's also a yes and no. But where was I? So if I don't think you can be angry if you don't believe in right or wrong. And I think I don't know if that's what you are saying or that is what you're not saying. Okay, first it sounded like you were saying, well, look, if you don't get angry, then there are lots of I'll see somebody doing something to my partner there and that I don't like, and if I'm not angry, I just won't do anything about it. Okay, I can give you some obvious counterexamples. Let's say your partner is being buried in an avalanche. You're out skiing and your partner's being buried in an avalanche. I think you would be highly motivated to go rescue her, even if you didn't think the avalanche was doing anything wrong or was bad or evil, right? So if you see somebody kicking the dog, why not just have the attitude, well, this is another natural phenomenon that I don't like, and I really want to rescue that dog from being kicked. Why do you have to be angry in order to be motivated to help somebody or to get in the way of something you really
so let me clarify. So it's not necessarily anger that makes you act, but like it all comes from subjective emotions or feelings.
I certainly agree with that. Totally agree with that.
So with the avalanche example, I'm not angry at the thing I can't control and is natural and not done by a malicious intent, but I'm in horror, or I'm in all these emotions, and so that's what pushes my desire to act, and so I'm motivated, and that's what happens.
Yeah, but again, this horror is, as you said, purely subjective. You don't have to, for example, say, oh, something objectively horrible is happening in the universe. The universe doesn't care about anything happening to your partner or you or anybody else. That is abundantly clear, right?
No, we're agreeing on this point, but it seems like you were saying that you've been meditating to bring yourself down to this understanding that I think we're having right now, which is that it's
meditating, as I understand it, one way that I understand it, is as gaining control of my own mind. That doesn't mean I have to control it to reduce my motivations. I meant it in the sense, reduce the intensity of a motivation. That means I can direct my attention to a different motivation, which could be equally as intense as the one I'm directing it away from. So what I was saying was, well, if I find myself in the possession of a compound intense motivation to get that guy to stop kicking that dog, all right? But upon analysis, I recognize that it really has two components. One is that I think the person is doing something objectively wrong. And the other is that I think that I don't like it. It hurts me. I'm empathetic. I hate the dog being put in pain like that. I don't like it, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying is, I think meditation has given me the power to, first of all, be able to analyze what's going on in my mind and say, hey, there's two different things here. They're quite different from each other. Well, maybe that didn't come from meditation so much as from a life of analytic philosophy, okay? That I could do that mental analysis and make that distinction. And then having made that distinction, I think meditation has given me the mental power to be able to direct my attention away from the moral motivation and strictly to the, let us call it, empathetic motivation. And there you, which could be
and then
quite
you can
intense.
act. Yeah.
And then I can act on it. I would. And not only can I would, because that's my that's my motivation. So,
Yeah.
you know, if that's what's motivating me, then if nothing gets in the way, that's what I'm going to do.
So I don't think we disagree on much, I guess.
No, I'm sure we don't.
Oh, no,
because we're both smart and, you know, think logically and.
I'm sure we disagree on a lot. In fact, there's a few things I want to come back to that I wanted to come back to.
No, I disagree that we disagree on anything.
So, yeah. Two things we wanted to come back to. One was we've been quite happily say there's no objective right and wrong, but then you said there's the good and bad that you want to talk about, and I wasn't quite. I'm not sure if I'm aware of that distinction or if I have. It's escaping me.
Oh, okay.
So let's make sure what we think on that. Let's do that first, I suppose, because that was, I don't know if I've missed that, but I don't think I believe in objective good.
It takes a while. Yeah, it takes a while. Again, one reason it's difficult to make distinctions like this is because everybody uses language sloppily, and we use some words that can have quite distinct meanings interchangeably, as if they just meant the same thing. That's called conflation, you know, blowing two different things together, right? And that's certainly true for terms like right and wrong on the one hand and good and bad on the other. So a lot of people just use them interchangeably. Oh, you did something wrong. Oh, you did something bad. You know, I mean, those are perfectly fine natural uses of those terms that they can be used in the same way. No problem.
Yeah.
But if we're trying to communicate, you know,
in this context, right?
In this case, you know, sometimes we have to say, yeah, but in other contexts, they're used to mean different things, and this is one of them, okay? So the way, and again, different people can distinguish them differently also. That's an added layer of complication, all right? So let's at least you and I can now try to communicate and use the words in the same way just for the sake of this present conversation. Okay, so I'll use the defining by way of examples. I think that's the best way to do it, because when you try to give a dictionary definition, it often leaves a lot to be desired. And if you try to do a full-fledged philosophical, analytical, conceptual analysis, that can take a lifetime and still not be finished, because we're still debating the meaning of concepts that Socrates, you know, was worrying about too, and we'll never get to the end. Okay, so somewhere in the middle is to just say, well, here's an example of what I mean by this word. Okay.
Yeah.
So right and wrong. Okay, so right and wrong would typically refer to an action. So kicking the dog is an action, and so I would say it's wrong if I were using moral terminology. Okay. Now, meanwhile, the dog is feeling pain presumably. And because that's not an action, but that's a state of affairs, let us say, then I would use the word, I would say that's something bad. The pain is bad. The feeling of pain is bad. It's something, well, that you don't like, but of course I don't like wrong things either, so that's not going to help us too much, but yeah. So, I have a bad pain.
Yep.
But if it had been caused by somebody just, some jerk just for no reason punching me in the chest, then I would say they had done something wrong. But I could say they did something bad too. And I could also say he was a bad person. I wouldn't say he was a wrong person. We don't use the language the word that way. We just happen not to, right? So right and wrong, in this restricted philosophical, ethical context, tends to be limited to actions. And I guess good and bad would maybe, I'll just say off the top of my head, would apply to everything else, things that are not actions.
I think the word you used was state was good, like as a state.
Yeah, but I also used it
works.
regarding persons. That persons are not states, right? You could have a bad person too. So,
yeah,
right?
okay. Well, you can have
right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I think that's still state.
Right in a different way.
State still works in that.
Oh, you think state works? How is that? When you say a bad person, that's a state of affairs? A bad person is a state of affairs?
Is it not the way they're constituted that makes them bad? If like they're a bad person, they're in a configuration that's making them bad. So that's why I'm thinking of that.
Wouldn't that just have the result of reducing all objects to states?
Maybe
because
that's
all objects are the way they are because of something.
That's probably just the computer programmer coming out of me. We think about terms, objects and states and things.
Well, again, depending on the context, right.
Yeah.
The words, the meaning of words comes from their use, is what Ludwig Wittgenstein taught us, and that is certainly something I believe. So whether but maybe this is actually related to what else I have to say on the subject, because even I would use good and bad. I would make another distinction about the use of good and bad.
Okay.
Because, well, the examples I gave exemplify this distinction now. Because if we talk about a bad person, we mean something moral. But if I say, oh, I have a bad pain in my chest, I don't think that's stereotypically a moral concept.
Sure.
We just mean it hurts. And it's something that really means I don't like it. That's a sense of bad, which just means, oh, it's really bad. It's something I really don't like. Mm-hmm. Or it's really unpleasant, something like that. But if we say, oh, that's a bad person, we don't just mean they're unpleasant. We just don't like them. We mean they're morally bad. There's something about their moral constitution and fiber that, smells. So the badness of a bad person is more analogous to the wrongness of a morally wrong act than is the badness of a toothache to the wrongness of a morally wrong act.
Yep.
Right. Now, I think, so what is my ultimate point here? Well, I guess my ultimate point is these are three distinct things. And so so what is an amoralist concerned about? If an amoralist certainly wants to get rid of the belief in objective right and wrong actions.
Yep.
Okay. Does an amoralist also want to get rid of the belief in objectively good or bad persons.
Yes.
I agree. All right.
And because earlier you questioned whether I also like threw out good and bad in this sense, and now knowing exactly what you meant, I wonder how it could be that I could say no to that, because they're basically both those right and wrong and good and bad relate to moral properties, which I don't believe exist. Or at least I have no reason to believe they exist.
Okay, that's my intuition too. Okay, now here's where it gets more interesting. What about good and bad in the sense of just like pains and so forth, things you just don't like, you know? Now, I think we agree that inherently these are not moral. This is not a moral kind of property, it seems. It's just, well, like a pain is a type of a feeling. It's a type of a sensation, which we have a desire with respect to. We don't like it or we like it, you know, a pleasure or a pain. Pleasure good, you know, pain bad, unless you're a masochist and it's the other way around. So,
well, maybe I was going to say, borrow from your background, from being a Kantian specialist. I mean, it's just in terms of hypothetical oughts, hypothetical obligations. Let's say the reason why you say I have a bad pain in my chest is because if you want to be healthy, a bad chest or a bad health state of your body is not going to be good for the purpose of being alive. So, you know, it's maybe that's a really odd example, but like if you have a purpose given to an object, like I have a knife that I want to cut for meat, or bad example for this audience. If I have a knife that I want to cut fruit with, it's a good knife if it cuts well, if it's sharp, perhaps.
Right.
So in
that's
this regard,
that's another sense of good and bad, which
is that not the same though?
Russell.
That's the guy.
Right, another Australian philosopher and a wonderful guy. I know him. I'm so sorry, I just wasn't certain of the name, but that's the name, Russell Blackford. He is a let's see, how shall I label him? I'm pretty sure he would consider himself to be a moral nihilist. And he's certainly sympathetic to moral abolitionism, but he has certain qualifications, including the one you just mentioned, as does another, well, probably the most famous Australian moral nihilist of all, J.L. Mackie. Mackie, you know, M-A-C-K-I-E.
Yeah, I've got his book here, I think.
Yeah, no longer with us. But you know, he was the one who really started the modern conversation in earnest. But I think he turned out to be a kind of a moral fictionalist in the end. But he was definitely, you know, right on. But he also would make the kind of point you just made, as Russell Blackford would make, about, well, you can have a good, you know, a good car, you know, a good pencil, a good knife, whatever. Yeah, that's yet another use. And all of these are mixed up together in one way or another. They certainly get mixed up, but whether they have, you know, do they have legitimate conceptual connections is the question we're really ultimately concerned about. It, you know, does it make sense that they would be mixed up?
But I don't think the amoralist has any problem with using hypothetical obligation, hypothetical oughts.
No,
like
you're right.
Knife,
you're right.
But
you're absolutely right. You know, but yes and no. I have become so averse to people being certain about things and thinking there's objective truth about, by pure coincidence, the things that they themselves happen to believe, that even the hypothetical uses of words like right, wrong, good, bad, etc., I wish we could soft pedal and avoid as much as possible. And I really try to practice what I preach. So, for example, if I'm listening to Leonard Bernstein's Second Symphony, The Age of Anxiety, which I just adore and love, okay? I will say that's good. You know, that's great. That is great. That's an example of great music, you know? And if I meet somebody who says, oh, I can't stand it, yeah, it's terrible, you know, I just, even though I know it's subjective, all I'm saying is I really love it. And I could even tell you why. I could give you all sorts of reasons why I love it, you know? But of course there are people who can't stand it, and they could give you reasons why they can't stand it. And of course I accept that aesthetics is subjective. I mean, there may be some, you know, again, there could be some wired in things that most humans happen to like some things better than others and so on and so forth. That could be true in the aesthetic realm as well as the moral realm. But I now try very consciously to say to somebody, you know, I just really love Leonard Bernstein, some of Leonard Bernstein's compositions. I just really love it. And I try not to say, oh, well, you know, the best symphony ever written was by Leonard Bernstein. You know, there's no question about it. I try not to talk about that. I try not to use best, you know, any language that would have.
So you're trying to be
an
really clear.
An objectivist connotation to it.
So your personal project, I guess, is to just say what you mean rather than assume any level of moral
in a literal sense,
language
in as literal sense as possible.
Right.
You can never be totally literal either. Probably everything we say is metaphorical in some sense or other. It's not an original thought to me by any means. But yeah, I guess I'm tending towards the literal. Now, but again, I don't want to be, as I said before, I don't want to be politically correct about things. I love beautiful language. You know, I don't want anybody, I prefer the King James version of the Bible. You know, I don't want to get rid of the Bible for that matter, even though I'm an atheist. I think it's great stuff. Loads of wisdom in it, loads of beautiful language in it, that translation and so forth. So I don't want to be a schoolmarm about all this stuff. I want to be reasonable about it. But, you know, it seems to me, by and large, there are just so many occasions when we just take for granted, you know, literally without thinking, we just do it habitually. We use objectivist denotating or connotating language. And I would like, even in the cases where I just want to say in all cases, when we can do without it, without harming something that we treasure like poetry and so forth, or if it's just, it would be ridiculous because we're just being playful or we're just being relaxed and so forth, so who cares how we talk, you know. But if we're just trying to speak, you know, in normal contexts and say what we mean and be clear and not have people misunderstand us and not generally promoting an atmosphere of objectivist thinking, then let's try to avoid it if we possibly can. And I make this explicit in my latest article. Well, I guess it's been published as a chapter in a book called Beyond the Surf and Spray. Beyond the Surf and Spray, which is a phrase from the English translation of Aristotle quoting the Odyssey.
So there's a couple lines of translation in that.
Yeah. But in the sense that I think it was intended by Aristotle, as I explain in the essay, in that essay, I make the point that I just made, you know, in nice, argumentative, analytic, articulate language, if you want to look into that. Okay, but to get back to the more substantive issue that you had raised, okay, about good and bad and everything, let's get back to the kind of good and bad, not the one about, you know, it's a good car, it's a good this, but which, you know, I totally understand the need for that. Well, but let's get back to the bad pain, that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
A lot of people want to link that up also with morality in a very deep way. And here again, I don't like that. I'm uncomfortable with that. And why? Well, first of all, why would somebody link it up in the first place? Because it's not a moral notion in itself, we've agreed. You know, if you have a bad pain, that's not in itself a moralistic notion. Okay, I guess if somebody says, if somebody says, "Oh, I have a pain, and it's really bothering me, and I'm really worried about it, and I hate it, and it might even be a heart attack or something," you can say all that without saying bad or good, you know. And it goes, if you're having a heart attack or whatever, we're not going to worry what words you use, okay? But if you're not, if you just say, "Well, I have, you know, this pain," and you don't have to use the word good or bad to fully express that you don't like it, you know, and it's a pain. You don't have to use good and bad, all right? So what's my objection to using good and bad about it? My objection is that a lot of people, maybe just about everybody, assumes that there are things that are objectively good for human beings and objectively bad for human beings.
Right. So like...
And I have trouble with that too. You do too?
Yeah, so is this what you would call ethical naturalism? Something like what Sam Harris tries to do by talking about the...
Well, ethical naturalism is when you're trying to retain moral language and give it an empirical naturalistic accounting.
Right.
I think that's yet a different sort of an issue. Yeah, they're all related, but
Sam Harris does something where he's trying to talk about there are certain things that we can say are actually better for humans than not, and so he calls that thing morality.
Right.
And I would say that's just putting a label on something that's
similar. Yeah. I let's not quibble right now, because again, you know, for philosophers, everything can be its own issue. Okay, so right, let's go with that for now. Yeah, that's fine. And so, well, no, but see, I can't let it go, because it does pertain to the things we're concerned about. I'm not a moral naturalist because I don't believe in morality. So I'm not concerned about... I certainly am a naturalist. You know, I believe in the natural world. In fact, I think that's all there is. Although, of course, there are things like mathematical entities, conceptual entities, which, you know, I also think those exist, and that's a problem. You know? So
that's another topic we could talk about.
Well, we could, but for the moment, when the philosophers talk about bracketing things, they use that term. We're going to bracket that issue, okay? Because, you know, ultimately everything is connected, right? Everything is connected. And as philosophers, we want to understand everything. So if we can't understand any one thing without understanding everything, because everything is connected, we would never understand any one thing. Well, in a sense, we never will. But at least we'd like to make a little progress with one thing, and then another thing, and another thing. And the only way we can possibly do that is by not talking about everything else at the same time. We'd have to talk about just enough other stuff so that we can make a little progress with this thing, you know, and then a little. Okay. So,
yeah. So I wasn't trying to take you another direction or trying to put words
like
like say.
Trying. No, I know. You're innocent until proven guilty.
Well, we'll get there. Yeah, I was just trying to maybe see if I understood what you were saying. So,
well, yes and no. Yeah, I was trying to say yes and no. No, in that moral naturalism is an accounting of morality. Is a defense of it. Well, it presumes there is morality. And you and I, well, I presume there isn't morality.
No. So that would be.
So I'm not a moral naturalist.
Of
You know?
course, yes.
All right. But yes, what you were saying in that some people think that there's a one-to-one correlation between certain natural states of affairs and whether they're good or bad. But remember, we're talking about the non-moral sense of good and bad. Remember? So this is not related to moral naturalism.
Okay.
We're talking about a good pain, a bad pain, you see? So that's the sense in which it's not moral naturalism, even though it's naturalism and connecting up to use of the words good and bad, but not the moral sense of good and bad. Got it?
Okay, yep,
Got
yep.
it. Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
didn't quite fully understand that myself either when I was first responding to you, but that's what dialogue is about. You know, both people get clear about what the other person's saying or what they're saying. Okay,
Yep.
great, a little progress there. So the point now that I'm trying to make, I wonder how many people will actually be watching this and get to this point, because this is the best part, right? No, you have to enjoy the way, you know, the path. You have to enjoy the path and not worry about the destination, all right?
Well,
So,
if that's the case, we should put the first 3 hours on before this as well, where we talked about everything else, about our interests in music and things like that.
whatever. We could, because, you know, in YouTube, you can actually, in the description, the verbal, the written part, description of the video, you can actually put links to the parts of the video. So we could put in a 10-hour YouTube, and then in the written description, we could have links saying, well, if you're just interested in the discussion of good and bad, you know, click here, and it'll take you right to that part of the YouTube. So we'll see. I wonder if there's a limit on how long a video you can upload to YouTube. But let me make my point, all right?
Please,
May I make my point?
Please, go ahead.
My point. That some people want to assert that, look, certain things are just good for a human being and are bad for a human being. And I think we had agreed, you and I agree that no. You know, I mean, there could be things that generally are, like maybe most human beings don't like to be stabbed with a sharp knife. But we know surely there are some who do like it. I mean, there's just such an infinite variety, or at some specific time anyway. You know, they're human beings are, you know, here's another yes and no. There's certainly such a thing, I would say, there's certainly such a thing as human nature. There, you know, we could apply endless specific qualities to what it means to be human, that anything that's human would share, I would think. But then there are endless ways that we're different from one another. And that with every single one of us, like every snowflake is absolutely unique, they say, you know? In the same way, every single human being is absolutely unique. And furthermore, there are major types of human beings. I have no doubt about that, starting with men and women. And I don't just mean physiologically. Of course they have different minds. Of course they do. Why would somebody think they would have the same mind when they have so much different physiology and so forth? Of course there's going to be differences. Not to put any value judgments on them, certainly not as an amoralist, right? That's the word. Why didn't I think to use that in the first? Value is the word. Value is the word that often gets attached to the kind of good and bad I'm talking about now.
Right, yeah.
Not value as opposed to moral. Now, this again is an absurd, not absurd, but a confusing distinction, because we talk of moral values, right? Right and wrong are moral values. And, okay, you have no moral values, you know. But But again, in philosophy, in order to be able to talk about something, we also have to make distinctions. So it's become very common to say, well, look, right and wrong, those are the moral values. That's what morality is about. Excuse me, don't call them that. Right and wrong is what morality is about. And good and bad is what value theory, that's what they call it, is what value theory is about.
Right.
So is pleasure the good? That's a question in value theory, you know? Is pleasure good? Well, what does it mean to say it's good in that sense, that non-moral, evaluative sense? What does that mean? Does it mean just, oh, people like it? Or does it have a deeper meaning? Or does it have a hypothetical meaning, like you were saying? Does it just mean that, well, it generally motivates to do things that are healthy for our bodies and will help us survive? That's why pleasure is good. And that's why pain is bad, because it tells us we have our hand sitting on a hot flame, and we want to be able to remove it quickly so we don't damage our tissue, right? Maybe that's what good and bad mean in this evaluative sense, you know? So that's an endless argument, you know? But the point is now that some people would distinguish value theory, good and bad in that sense, from moral theory, which is about right and wrong. And also, of course, to confuse it again, good and bad people, using good and bad in the sense that applies to people, that would also go in the moral category, in the moral hopper, all right?
Right.
So the point I want to make, well, you know, point, subpoint, meta point, is that the kind of amoralist I am, both in terms of moral nihilist and not believing in the objective existence of some things, and in the sense of moral abolitionist, in the sense of wanting us not to think in these terms at all, okay? For me, that encompasses both morality in the sense of right and wrong, or good and bad people, and good and bad in the sense of value theory. I don't think any of them are objective. I just hit pause. I
don't think you did. I can still see recording.
I'm now hitting pause. Well, what did I hit?
I don't know.
This is very strange. Let me try it again. For the audience at home, if you're using Zoom, be very careful when you think you've hit pause, you've actually hit pause. I'm looking at it, says pause.
All right. So, well, we're just talking about the merits of moral abolitionism, and I think we found some agreements, and I think there's probably a lot more we could be talking about and
For sure.
Figuring out the differences of.
But I only have the rest of my life to do it. We're not going to have enough time.
If only there was a situation where there was a pandemic and it forced everyone to get onto Zoom and to talk when they're locked down to their houses anyway.
Wouldn't that be great? A pandemic would be just the ticket. Yeah, then we could have these conversations. You know, we are actually living Socrates' vision of what would he call it? Hades? That has a negative connotation for us nowadays, but heaven, I would call it Socratic heaven. We are living Socratic heaven now with Zoom, and for some of us anyway, a lot of time on our hands, because we can talk with anybody on earth who's willing to talk with us.
That's why you have to look to the other side of the world.
Yeah, right.
To find someone else.
Exactly. But I hit the jackpot because hitting your side of the world, because again, you've got, I've got Matt Hansen here, and on my right is Matt Hansen, right? And on my left, I've got Russell Blackford, Okay, I've got Richard Joyce, and there was Ian Hinkfus, departed. J.L. Mackey, departed. And there's someone else I know, Alan Duncan, a name to keep in mind. Alan, you'll be hearing about that name in the near future, I'm pretty sure. All of these
I can guess why.
Amazing moral nihilists in Australia and maybe New Zealand. I can't remember some of them are from New Zealand. It's amazing that they're all in. So I hit the jackpot when I discovered Australia, and so I'm in Socratic heaven, because I can now just Zoom with any of these people. Well, the ones who are living, and again, the ones who are willing to Zoom with me. It is great.
Maybe there's one thing we need to clarify before we wrap this up. You've been saying moral nihilist. I've been saying moral nihilist. Is it a thing where like it's objectively right to say it one way or the other, or is it just a thing where the Australians and New Zealanders say it one way, or is it just a thing where I'm the one who's wrong? Because
Yes and no. Come on, man. You know the answer to that question.
I think I've looked it up before. I'm pretty sure it's just one of those British First Americanisms.
I can sum it up. Some say nihilist, and some say nihilist.
Now I'm going to say yes.
Oh, and then there's people like you, but that's beyond the pale.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, it's been a pleasure.
Oh,
have our first chat, and I'm looking forward to picking this up again, hopefully soon.
I remember this after all these years. It was a letter to the editor of the Journal of the American Philosophical Association. Just the proceedings of before it became a journal, it was just the proceedings of the American Philosophical Association. And a newlywed woman wrote a letter to the editor of the proceedings, which was published, saying, let me tell you what it's like to marry a philosopher. For our honeymoon, we went to this philosophy convention, and that was the last I saw of him. For the whole honeymoon when he went to the sessions. And that's it.
It's funny because that could be very much like my story, because as you know, I just recently got engaged, and so we've been talking about honeymoons, and I've been wanting to go to America, and so who knows, maybe you're heading up your way.
She'll never let you go now. Don't let her see this video. Oh, she already knows what has happened. She already knows. Oh, that's terrible. That's
very funny.
So supposedly wait a minute. So this is beyond conceiving.
But we've actually,
I hope she at least got a good night's sleep. Is getting a good night's sleep.
We'll find out tomorrow.
All right. Well, I hope our audience is enjoying the frivolity. This is what life in philosophy is like. It's nothing but frivolity. The deepest questions about the most serious things taken lightheartedly. Because, my God, when you think about everything and get a global perspective on it, it's like, in a way, you become like God. If there is a God and he's looking down upon the human condition, he's like, this is hilarious. All the tragedies and everything, but you can't help laughing at, even like from my Jewish tradition, it's like, not that I'm into it that much, but I guess I do partake of this particular trait that when things get really horrible, you just start telling jokes. They can be very cynical jokes and so forth, but it just becomes so absurd at a certain point. Things get so awful. If you don't adopt a sense of humor about it, you're really lost. That's like adding moralism on top of not liking something. Add being totally bummed out by something that you're already totally bummed out by. I mean, if you can't, at least see the absurdity and as it were, humor in it, you're totally lost, because the human condition is or the animal condition, considering humans as a type of animal, of course, but considering all the animal condition, as Darwin well knew, is horrendous. And we don't think so. And you know, who's that? Benatar, the philosopher Benatar, the living philosopher, has argued that, you know, he thinks it's morally wrong, I think, to have children.
Right.
Because if you just objectively spell out the human condition, you know, you see that having children is a purely selfish act on the part of the parents. And if I were still a moralist, I think I would agree. I would absolutely agree with that argument. Since I'm not a moralist, I think we make decisions on different bases. And I can still see why, you know, yes and no. Some people would have, I would consider rational reasons for that I could agree with to some degree for having children, and others I would agree for not having children, and so it goes. Why nobody should have, not should, don't say, why would they think the world would, well, again, how to let's not get into that question again, how to phrase it, okay?
Watch the start of the video.
Right. But you get the point. So life is tough. And the reason a lot of, you know, to the degree that people do not think that life is bad, if there are people who think with those concepts, I think is that they're not paying attention. And sometimes they're deliberately, intentionally not paying attention. Just like people who enjoy the taste of meat will honestly say, yeah, I know it's horrible what we do to the animals, and I know I don't need to eat them, but, you know, I just don't want to think about it. I just don't want to think about it. You know, they will honestly say that, because they know if they did think about it, they would stop eating meat. Okay. Well, magnifying that, you know, I think most of us, including me, just don't want to think all the time, or maybe even any time, about how awful life is, not only for oneself, maybe not at the moment, you know, but at times, and maybe as you get older, if you live so long in the future and so forth, but also how awful it is for other people and other animals, and maybe most of the time, and through most of history, and maybe most of the foreseeable future. The future does not look rosy right now, even the near future. And I'm not talking about the pandemic, folks. Lots worse than that seems to be coming, and very quickly. So if you spend your whole time thinking about that and taking it with the utter seriousness that an objectivist would seem to say it requires, well, you'll be so miserable, you'll kill yourself if you're rational, you know? But no. Human beings, well, they have various responses. One, I think most human beings just become irrational at that point and subscribe to some kind of supernatural fairy tale. You know, well, God will make it all good in the end. There's a wonderful afterlife. This is just a testing ground, you know, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And others will, who are more rational in my view of rationality, will say, no, that's just fairy tales. That's nonsense. Life is tough. But they'll adopt what I just characterized as, you know, kind of sort of a Jewish kind of response as well. You know, it's so awful, it's absurd, it's funny, really. You got to laugh about it. You just got to go with the flow and somehow, you know. So there's that kind of response. And others will just become phlegmatic and just say, well, you know, there's the good stuff, there's the bad stuff. Try not to dwell too much on the bad stuff, you know, but really life is kind of, you know, maybe it evens out, but it really doesn't even out. It's mostly bad, but why focus on it? Because that'll just make you feel miserable. So just kind of focus on the good stuff. But I'm not, you know, I don't believe in any fairy tales. That's just the way it is. Maybe a Zen Buddhist is like that. maybe that's what Zen Buddhism is. Just face reality and don't make a big deal out of it one way or another, and be, happy about the good things that come your way. But when the bad things come, that's it. What are you going to do? So this is itself a whole philosophical topic, and we were just saying goodbye to each other.
Yeah, I know.
That's what a life in philosophy is like. That was my point, wasn't it?
Yeah, it reminds me. Saying comes to mind is B.B. King, the musician, said, "If I didn't have bad luck, I'd have no luck at all." So that's always fun. All right. Well, we'll wrap that up.
But we have good luck, right? You and I have had a lot of good luck in life so far, right? Would you say that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, if we just want to be like, without getting deep on the terms, yes, absolutely. I've been born in a time when I've got food and shelter and warmth and all that sort of stuff. And personally, of course, yeah. Exactly.
And the age we live in, a pandemic like this, I was going to say it would be so much worse in a previous age, but that's actually not true, because in a previous age, it would not have spread. It's only
in
now
a previous
that it
age,
can spread like this.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right.
So, okay, yes and no, good and bad, up and down, right and wrong. It's all like the Hindu god, up and down, crush, uplift. Okay. Goodbye. Until we meet again. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've enjoyed every second of it.
I definitely have myself. So, yep,
Okay.
We'll sign
I'm going to click
off and
end session now. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
See ya. We'll talk again. Bye.